So given all of that, like what gives you hope, right? Like for any kind like or does anything like for any kind of like positive change, in the system, like if it's too hard to get in, right? Like what do you think people's best chance of affecting change might be?
Um, okay, so this is where it gets really difficult, really complicated. On some level, I guess we'll start small and we'll go big from there. At the smallest level, if you want to make change in the electoral sphere, it's a lot easier to like break into like a city council meeting and like push for like bigger structural changes. Like, so for example, right, the real estate lobby is a huge, huge lobby, and it's a huge impediment to like change, right? It's a huge impediment to change. Like real estate lobbyists, people who are, like big landlords and these corporate investors and stuff like that, they tend to be some of the most reactionary. So if you're a city council member and you want to like deal with some issues there, you could literally push for like land reform projects. You could push for like housing cooperatives. You could push for, bread and butter stuff that improves people's material needs, that helps get landlords out of town. So that like once the capital is sort of no longer there and things have been switched to a more cooperative model, then all of a sudden you're going to see change in Congress from the representatives that are representing that area. Because of course, if the real estate lobby isn't in town, they're going to have a lot harder time influencing your local congressional campaigns. But then there's the more material aspect, because this is where I think one of the most important things for people to understand, that is the politics of the material, right? Not the politics of the procedural. The reality is that, like, if you imagine like a critical industry in like transportation, right? Um, a few workers at a few different train stations, for example, that do like shipping and handling, um, they could basically shut down the entire economy of a city if they really wanted to and they wanted to organize. And there's a few other industries where, um, workers could do that together. So like coordinated strikes, right? And workers basically like doing strikes or slowdowns, even boycotts, things like that can make a really, really huge difference, because the reality is if we know that politicians by and large work for giant corporations, and these giant corporations start to see the economy go a direction that they don't like it, and we recognize that these companies can't make any money without the workers that are working there, well, then you start to realize that a couple of rail workers going on strike could basically, like, I mean, honestly, if every rail worker in the United States went on strike tomorrow, we would have Medicare for all overnight if that's what they were asking for. Because whenever people in power are scared of their bank accounts, then all of a sudden change happens really, really fast. But on the more global scale, like the reality is like the one beacon of hope that I see in the world, and I know a lot of people might react to this pretty starkly, but the beacon of hope that I see in the world, it really is China, right? What is happening right now is China is approaching the world, right? The entire world with a trade policy of peace, right? A trade policy of neutrality, basically, where, they'll do trade deals with people like Duterte, right, who's an extreme sort of right-wing figure, but then they'll also like do trade with, Vietnam, Cuba, Bolivia, right? And so really China is going to the global south and basically offering, hey, through economic partnerships, we can sort of free you from the structural adjustment programs from the IMF and the World Bank and things like that, that force your countries into poverty. And, if we have a close enough partnership, the United States won't feel comfortable invading your country because, they don't want to have to deal with any type of economic sanctions or, speed bumps that might come from like sanctions from China, obviously. And so when you combine that with the fact that like China really is the only major world power that's taking climate change seriously, over the past 20 years, like China has been responsible for lifting about 800 million people out of poverty. Like these things, right? Even though obviously it's not a perfect country, when it comes to their relationship with the rest of the world, they are really eroding the United States' ability to be the sort of dictator of global economic policy. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now with a lot of the instability we're seeing in the United States as a result of the fact that we don't really have the ability to bully other countries around the same way that we used to. And so the multipolarity is really creating an opening for sort of a more democratic world. The scary part about that, though, is that with the United States finally having a contender again for like global influence over the world economy, because we have to like start playing fair instead of playing with bombs. Um, Now the United States is becoming more unstable. So it looks like things in the United States are going to get a lot worse very, very quickly, very, very fastly. But at the same time, for the rest of the world, now they see a world where instead of being forced to do what the United States wants, they can play a game where they can actually bargain between China and the United States and develop their own path.
Wow. So the key is to get regular people to get to rally and get together and actually do something, like what Bernie almost did. um,
Yeah.
how do you do that?
Well, I mean, with that, it just is really difficult because like a lot of Americans, like, I mean, for what I said about China, for example, there's a lot of Americans that have like really strong ideas about what China is. And the reason for that is a lot of Red Scare propaganda, right? That's not to say it's a perfect place, but that Red Scare propaganda, like, is really, really deep seated in the United States. And so, like, when you have people running around talking about, like, oh, all these socialist countries, they're evil dictatorships, even though, like, by any reasonable measure, they're democracies, right? Like Cuba is a perfect example of this. They actually just rewrote their entire constitution like 2 or 3 years ago, and in a public referendum, something around like 90% of the population voted in favor of their new constitution. So like, you have these like democracies that we try to paint as like these evil, like authoritarian dictatorships or whatever. And so whenever you have people like organizing workplaces, like the sort of anti-communist sentiment that exists within a lot of Americans really really is one of the biggest barriers, because like a lot of people, when it comes to labor unions are terrified of being labeled as socialist. So they end up structuring themselves in such a way that is more amenable to those who are in power here in the United States. And so when you have labor unions that are less willing to be confrontational, then you get this working class sentiment against labor unions where they feel like the labor union isn't fighting for them. But at the same time, if the labor union was fighting for them a lot harder, then all of a sudden you start to see all these people saying, oh, that's communism, how dare you? Um, and so that really, I think, becomes one of the biggest challenges, is sort of getting people to recognize that capitalism isn't working, but not only is capitalism not working, but like socialism is actually a pretty good option. And so as long as people are taking socialism off the table and they're refusing to engage with any type of like Marxist politics, their anti-capitalism has nowhere to go. Their anti-capitalism really has nowhere to go. So it's hard to like build any type of unified effort, because then all of a sudden it becomes a situation of herding cats. Everybody wants to reinvent socialism without the word socialism. They've all got their own unique ideas about how to do it. And they're not engaging with any of the like tried and true methods that other countries have done, right? They're not willing to look at like workers' struggles in Vietnam. They're not willing to look at workers' struggles in, Cuba or Bolivia. And if they're not willing to look at those successful workers' struggles, then we're sort of doomed to follow a path of sort of disorganization that just has proven itself not to work. I mean, you can just look at the previous labor movements in the United States, for example. Um, Basically, all it took to squash those movements was for the United States military to basically kill and or imprison some of the major leadership within those movements. And so really, like, anti-communism and Red Scare propaganda is a really, really big barrier to getting workers to organize within their own workplaces. And that's not to say that everybody needs to be like a super like educated like Marxist that studied all the theory, but just knowing enough to not think that communism is this ultimate boogeyman is really what it takes to understand the material power that comes with workers withholding their labor and really understanding what those demands could be. Because ultimately, the difference between like a liberal approach to unionization and like a socialist approach to unionization really rests in the question of the relationship to capital and the relationship to power. Socialists want to change the relationship between employers and employees. Socialists want to change the relationship between landlords and tenants, right? A liberal reform just asks for more concessions within the existing framework. But as long as we maintain the existing framework, that still leaves landlords and employers with all of the bargaining chips. And then you have to find yourself fighting the same fight, every couple of decades, like we're doing right now. And so we really just have to get people to a point where when they're organizing, when they're going on strike, they understand the material power of the position they have as workers and are fundamentally asking for structural changes to the relationship that workers have with their workplace, structural changes to the relationship that tenants have to the buildings that they live in, and pushing for, cooperative models and calling for a restructuring of the way that the American political system works on the whole, because ultimately, by design, the United States was not designed to be a democracy. It was very much designed to be a dictatorship of capital. It was designed to be a democracy that was exclusively for the rich, by the rich. And you can see that in the structures of the Senate, the way Supreme Court justices are appointed. The founding fathers were actually very clear about this. James Madison talked about his opposition to what he called the tyranny of the majority, which, a Marxist would refer to as the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is to say the state works on benefit of the workers to suppress the, exploitation that comes with capitalists. And so without that understanding, and with all of this Red Scare propaganda that people have, really, there just becomes these big hangups where people will go on strike, they'll fight for an extra $2 an hour, and then everything they fought for will be erased within 5 years of inflation.